Hello film fans and welcome to this episode of the Sherlockian. Now I thought today I'd review the recent Western, The English. And this is a little bit of a departure from me. The other historical stuff I reviewed before were actually based on real life events. Now as far as I know, The English is entirely fictional. But I thought it was worth a review despite that because actually it's got a lot of respect for real life historical events. It's one of the most authentic historical dramas that I've ever seen. And without knowing the history, you actually lose something from the narrative. Although, of course, it's quite possible to just enjoy it as a drama series without knowing anything about the history behind it at all. But it actually does quite a lot of quite radical stuff. So, for example, the way it treats Native Americans in the narrative is really, really interesting. So, as I'm sure you know, traditional Westerns generally tended to vilify Native Americans. In the kind of cowboys and Indians, typical Western, the Indians are almost invariably the enemy. And even if they aren't the enemy, like say, like the Lone Ranger, they're kind of, the sidekick of the main white character. Now, you could argue that in the English something similar happens, except of course that in this narrative it's the Pawnee scout Eli Whip who is actually the more competent of the two and who actually carries a lot of the narrative behind him. Now, leaving all that aside for a moment, what I really like about the portrayal of Native Americans is that it's actually very authentic and actually it's very respectful, but it's also very realistic. So, for example, it doesn't brush over the kind of contradictions to sort of Native American culture. Nowadays, we tend to see this sort of expansion of the West as kind of good versus bad, kind of white people versus Native Americans. But in reality, as the English shows, it was a lot more complicated than that. Some Native American tribes, like for example Whip's tribe, the Pawnee, and others like the Blackfoot, sided with the US Army and acted as scouts, while there were others like the Sioux who almost invariably opposed the expansion of the American nation and fought against it. The other thing I really liked about it was that it didn't shy away from showing the kind of more unpleasant aspects of Native American culture without vilifying them. It just shows you how it was. So, for example, there's an absolutely brilliant scene in it where you meet a very minor character called Black-Eyed Mog. Now, Black-Eyed Mog is a very unpleasant person on the face of it. She's head of a gang of bushwhackers, highway robbers, and she seems to have no quandaries about robbing and killing people and letting her sons rape women. But you soon learn that and she's wearing a very typical kind of a Western European costume for the 19th century. She's kind of got like a widow's cap on, and she's got sort of very done up, very sort of straight laced. And then when she's talking with Emily Blunt's character, she draws back the cap and takes off these kind of like goggles she's wearing, which again were quite common to sort of protect women's eyes from the sun. And she takes them off, and you see that her eyelids have all been cut away. It's quite horrific. The special effects are brilliantly done, and then she pulls back the cap, and you can see she's been scalped. And he suddenly puts in relief her entire character. The fact that she hates Native Americans, she's got like 50 scalps that she's pinned up on her wall, taken from a variety of Native Americans, men, women, and children. And it doesn't justify her behaviour, but it does at least explain it. I really like that. It wasn't afraid to show that some aspects of Native American culture actually seem quite brutal to us nowadays. However, I suppose, practical they seem to Native Americans, because of course things like ritual mutilation, particularly of dead bodies, while it seems abhorrent to us now and abhorrent to white people at the time, it actually made a lot of sense. It was, basically to prevent the spirits of people you killed coming back and haunting you. So actually, it was quite practical, albeit quite a brutal thing to do. And it's the same with the white characters. These like central premise of the or I suppose the central secondary plot, should we say, it concerns a massacre carried out by rogue US Army units on a innocent village of Shetland Native Americans. And it doesn't brush over this. Indeed, the scene where it happens, you don't even see it, but you hear the sound of the guns, and it's absolutely amazing. The kind of impact this scene has without showing any of the violence at all. It's actually far more effective than if you'd seen it happen on screen. And yet, what I really enjoyed about it is, again, while it doesn't condone, obviously, the massacre, it does at least try and give you some kind of understanding as to why somebody might have carried it out. You hear about the fact that one of the brothers of the men involved has been again killed and apparently tortured by the Native American chief Running Hawk, who they're looking for. Now, as far as I know, Running Hawk's got nothing to do with the village they massacre, and indeed it's even kind of hinted that Running Hawk's act is actually itself an act of revenge against these men for something else they've done. But at least it does try and show the kind of tit-for-tat kind of conflict that went on during the kind of what they're often known as the Indian Wars, which again I really like. It doesn't again kind of side with one side or the other. It just shows you history as it happened, which I really appreciate, and it kind of leads the viewer to make up their own mind as to who is in the right and who is in the wrong. I think you're supposed to assume really that the army units are in the wrong, quite right, because they've massacred an entire village. But nevertheless, it does at least try and let you understand why somebody might indulge in such a horrible act. There's also some other really lovely minor niche pieces of history that you may not have picked up on. So, for example, the bit I really enjoyed is the bit in the second episode where you see the English ranch owner Trafford approach the sheriff of the new town. Now, at first, the sheriff seems very suspicious of Trafford and indeed slightly rude to him. And this is never explained in the narrative, and indeed it almost seems a bit out of character for him. When we later see him, he actually seems very conscientious, and is willing even to investigate the town's patron when he comes under suspicion of actually doing something wrong. So why is he so suspicious at first then? Well, the discerning viewer might have noticed that the sheriff is Irish. Well, of course, Trafford is English. He's not only English, he's an English aristocrat. And you might perhaps not have picked up on this, but basically, this is the series is set in about 1890. So the sheriff would probably, I mean, he looks about middle-aged, maybe 50. So he almost certainly would have lived through, as a young child, the Irish potato famine, or the Irish grape famine, as it's often called, which was about between 1845 and 1852. So, as a child, he probably saw, but obviously saw widespread suffering when the Irish potato crop failed. He saw, children starving to death in the streets, people even resorting to eating each other. There was a legend in Ireland about hungry ground, where basically if somebody in the famine died on a piece of ground and you stood on it, you yourself would basically fade away if you didn't move off it and run around quickly. It's almost like the entire country was infected. Which is a very kind of almost horrifying myth. There's even stories about old women lighting fires out in the countryside to attract basically young children, of people who would often starve to death before they let their children die. And these old women, so it was said, and probably there is some truth based on these stories, would basically lure these sort of rogue children sort of running homeless around the countryside to the fires and then kill and eat them, just to try and survive a bit longer. And so if you've seen any number of those horrific events, and you've also seen the English completely ignore it and say things like, well, what can we expect from the Irish? They're all lazy, no wonder they're all starving to death, which some English people did, you can quite understand why you might be a little bit suspicious, maybe even a bit rude to an English aristocrat you've just met. And it's never even stated in the text. The Irish potato family is never even mentioned in the series, but it is a lovely piece of niche history to know about, and I think it probably did affect the way they wrote the character on screen, so it's absolutely brilliant. There's also a similar scene when Emily Blunt's character meets those two, well, I was going to call them ex-Scottish, because they don't speak with a Scottish accent, but they talk about having, been born in Scotland. I think they're laying telegraph wires, if I remember rightly, towards the end of the series, and they do actually mention the clearances again. But now they never explain really what the clearances are in the series, and they just kind of assume what they were. But basically, they were again very similar kind of examples of English, or at least aristocratic kind of arrogance and cruelty in Scotland. Basically, Scottish landowners, often English, let's be honest, basically realised they could make far more money off their land in the Scottish Highlands if they let them graze sheep on it, rather than if they had like tenant farmers that farmed the land and paid rent for it. So obviously they couldn't just evict all of them, or at least they couldn't get away with evicting everybody. So what they did instead was, at least they couldn't get away with evicting everybody without cause. So what they did was they raised all the rents colossally high, so basically these poor Scottish farmers couldn't pay it, And then once they'd done that, and they could then evict them, with a just cause, they can't pay their rents anymore, they then grazed the land with sheep and made a lot more money out of it. And a lot of these crofters basically ended up emigrating to the colonies, often America or Canada. So again, it makes sense. One, while they're hostile towards Emily Blunt, who is clearly a posh English woman, but also why they seem very reluctant to kind of admit any kind of culpability towards their actions towards Native Americans. If you've lost your land once, you're going to be very unlikely to basically lose it again, and you're going to be very protective of it, which again really informs their characters and again gives them some kind of justification. Again, we don't necessarily have to like what they're doing or even agree with it, but it does make the series far better that you can think, oh yeah, I kind of see why you'd act like that if you'd been through that kind of life experience. Yeah. So again, it really informs the show and makes it much better, I think. The other thing I really liked in that scene, and this is a very nerdy piece of history, and I do apologise for saying this, but basically, when they have that gunfight where they're riding out again, and they start firing at them, you see that one of the Scottish gentlemen is lying down as he fires. He's lying down, but not lying down prone, so on his front, like we would expect, with snipers nowadays. He's lying on his back, and he's kind of leaning back with his head, isn't he? And he then rests his rifle on his leg. Now, you might have thought that looked really weird and wondered why he did it, but in the 19th century, with target shooting, that was how people fired. I'm not entirely sure why. I presume I suppose they didn't have things like bipods back then, the little leg things that attach to the front of rifles nowadays. So I suppose it was probably the most, the steadiest rest you could actually get, your own body essentially, and lying back on like a kind of cushion. But I really like the fact they took the trouble to show that kind of style of shooting. I mean, they didn't need to. I'm sure. I mean, I knew vaguely about this, but I wouldn't have at all have quibbled if they hadn't shown it. The other thing I really enjoyed, as somebody that's done a bit of target rifle shooting, I did really enjoy the way they actually showed them actually working the sights in. Generally speaking, in films, they don't bother with things like that because I mean it's a bit dull, really, isn't it? So what they normally do is they just show them like they'll take, if somebody's trying to shoot somebody at long range, they take the shot and now they hit, they miss. You don't ever see them trying to adjust their sights. With this, they actually worked it into the plot, and actually it adds to the suspension. The fact that they're gradually lining the shot up. They get they first of all they get the line. So basically, which basically whether it's actually on the target as opposed to whether it's actually within the right range, and then they sort of work their way up gradually so they get closer and closer and closer, and it's absolutely brilliant scene. But again, it shows a really nice niche knowledge of kind of 19th century history, which I really, really appreciated. So yeah, that was my very quick historical view of the English. I mean, again, it's not a historical piece by any means in the sense that it's real, but it is very authentic to the time period. I'm sure there are some very small kind of inaccuracies you could pick out. Generally speaking, if you look hard enough at costume or weapons, you can find something. But what I really enjoyed is that they clearly had a really good knowledge of the history behind it, and they didn't beat you over the head with it. Just a lot of historical drama series, they like to show how clever they've been or how much research they've done, and they'll actually mention things in a way that doesn't quite add up to how people talk in real life, just to show the fact that they've done the research. But with this, they basically did the research and then didn't bother to show it. It's just behind it, and if you know where to look, you can see it. But it doesn't particularly affect the viewing of a normal, just an average kind of viewer. It's just there if you want to look for it, which I really enjoyed. So yeah, that was the Sherlockian. Thank you very much for watching, film fans. If you want to subscribe to the channel, feel free. Obviously, you can click the icon down below. You can also follow me on Twitter if you want to. There's a link in the video description. And if you'd like to see me do any more historical kind of reviews, and you've got any suggestions, feel free to pop them in the comments. I'll be very grateful for any of your thoughts. But yeah, that was the Sherlockian. Thanks very much for watching, film fans, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.